Hello, good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Gus Crane. I'm a member of the Student Lecture Series here at the Cooper Union Erwin S. Cannon School of Architecture. Yeah. We're excited to be joined by Paulo Tavares for tonight's lecture. Paulo Tavares is an architect, writer, and educator. His work has been featured in various exhibitions and publications worldwide, including Harvard Design Magazine, Istanbul Design Biennial, and the São Paulo Art Biennial. He's the author of the books Forest Law, Des Habitat, and Memória de Terra, and was a curator of the 2019 Chicago Architecture Biennial. He currently teaches spatial and visual cultures at the University of Brasília in Brazil, and leads the architectural agency Autonoma. I'd like to thank Lise Jaffe and Jeffrey Brown for their continued support of the Student Lecture Series. And without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome Paulo Tavares.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay, cool. Thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate the invitation, especially because it's in a student lecture series. So it's really great to have the opportunity to share some work with you. I am speaking with you now from Brazil, Brasília, the capital, the middle of the country. I hope that my internet won't drop. Sometimes the internet is not super stable here, but hopefully we won't have any problems. And again, thank you for Cooper Union, thank you for the students, and thank you all for coming this evening. What I want to do is something quite informal, in fact, and just show some projects, some recent projects that I have been dealing with. And I guess the sort of main stream of this presentation is to try to expose a kind of complicity between modernism and modernization with colonialism, both in past as well as in the present. And considering this, how we can deploy the idea of architecture or the tools of architecture or architecture itself, and here, architecture conceived in a kind of very expanded way, incorporating different forms of, producing space and producing media space, and how we can conceive architecture as what I'm calling a means of advocacy. I'm going to share some projects with you, 3 or 4. I don't know how long I would take because this is somehow improvised. So in the middle of the lecture, I might stop, and I hope I have a chance to show all the projects, but maybe that won't be possible because of timing. Let me try to share my screen with you. Can you see a wide screen? Yep. Okay, cool. So this idea that it's very important for me in the various sort of manifestations of my work is, if the cities are right, if the spaces are right, if territories is right, if the environment is right, spatial practices, architecture should be conceived as a form of advocacy, and not only in terms of building space, but in the most sort of diverse and overlapping fields through which architecture operates, including curating, writing, pedagogy, preservation strategies, writing, so on and so forth. I'm going to start by showing a project called Des Habitat. Des Habitat was commissioned by the exhibition Bauhaus Imaginista that happened in 2019, curated by Marion von Osten, who is not with us anymore. This project was in the context of this exhibition, or the commemorations of Bauhaus, and it deals with the magazine produced by Lina Bobardi, the Italian-Brazilian architect, very much famous for her unique approach to popular culture. And Habitat was a kind of mainstream vehicle to the dissemination and formation of a public attuned to the aesthetics of modernity. And for me, from very early on, it was really interesting to see how, Habitat would bring many images of indigenous objects, indigenous sculptures, indigenous bodies, and always compare them or use them as a sort of resource to establish what was a modern language, indeed a modern habitat. Of course, we know that this relationship between the primitive and the modern is somehow structural to the very idea of modernity, right? Or the avant-garde modernity. The difference in Brazil is that this approximation with the indigenous, with the primitive, was conceived as a trace of nationality, right? So it was not about only modernism in its relation to the primitive, but it was also, a sign of nationality. Somehow, avant-garde artists in Brazil were saying, we are more primitive than Europe. Therefore, it's a trace of national art. It's a trace of national culture. There's no Eastern dimension that modernism want to incorporate in order to break with, classic language. And so this image of indigenous objects in habitat, they appear as if they were, as signifiers of this primitive modernity. And I was very curious, and they appear very isolated, right? You don't have a context to situate them. Rather, they appear isolated as aesthetic objects that signify modernity. And from very early on, I was interested to understand where does this image came from, those objects came from. How come that, photographs of indigenous objects could appear in a sophisticated magazine such as Habitat as signifiers of modernity. So what we do in this project is really a kind of archaeology of media, archaeology of habitats, trying to identify the different ways in which these indigenous objects were appearing in the magazine and trying to trace where they came from and where their image came from. And the appearance of these objects and images of these objects to be consumed by the modern urban elites was related to what was officially called in Brazil the politics of pacification. So the politics of pacification meant, it's just, politics of pacification was a strategy deployed by the Brazilian state. There was a specific agency to do that, that was called the Service for the Protection of Indians. And the objective of this agency was to contact indigenous groups, indigenous nations, and quote unquote, pacify them so that the state, or we can say the colonial state or their settler state, could occupy those lands. So basically what they were doing were this sort of gift exchange using Western objects to make contact with these populations, and eventually also allowing, religious entities to colonize those areas, to enter those areas, and trying to domesticate, trying to pacify, trying to bring this population into the realm of the nation state, as well as into the realm of ideological beliefs pertaining to Catholicism and to Western culture in general. And it's interesting to see that the way they operated was by establishing outposts in the middle of indigenous territories and trying to attract them to this outpost so they could be, schooled and disciplined. I don't know if this is the way I should speak, turning to the discipline of modernity and becoming Brazilian national citizens. And it's interesting because the name of the agency, Service for the Protection of the Indians, was also related to the fixation of the Brazilian worker. And here we see that this modern mode of colonization was somehow already established in 18th century. This was the so-called descimentos, right? So colonizers were setting up those outposts, those indigenous outposts, and doing the same sort of ways of governing those populations as it was being done in modernity. And here, here's a map of the outposts of the Service for the Protection of the Indians. So you see that by the 50s, when Habitat started to be published, they ran a complex and wide-ranging network of indigenous outposts to pacify all the populations in Brazil. And I also I always like to show this image of these outposts that, cover the whole territory of the country in comparison to an image, to a map produced by anthropologist Courtney Muandaju, where he maps all the different languages, all the different nations that occupy the Brazilian territory in the 40s. So you see that it's a kind of what I call plurinational territory. And somehow the strategy of the state was to dismantle this plurinationality in order to construct, an hegemonic view of what was the nation and what was the nation state through colonization. And of course, that this network of outposts not only opened the land of indigenous people for colonization, but also opened their territories for reporters, for anthropologists, for image makers that would not only, let's say, colonize their land, but also colonize their image, capture their image, so they could be consumed by the urban elites. And it's interesting that the Service for the Protection of the Indians, it had what they call a section of studies, which was in fact a kind of branch of multimedia production, as well as, collecting objects of these indigenous groups. And here we see, objects collected by the Service for the Protection of the Indians of the Carajá people in a form of sort of museum-like display, which are the same objects that would appear in habitats, making this relationship, signifying the primitive in relationship to the modern. With the Carajá people were one of the most featured groups in habitats because of their, kind of the ceramic dolls that were very expressive and, in a certain way, very didactic, to show the public how this primitive language was at the core of modernism. So you would read, different texts in Habitat comparing those sculptures with Matisse, Picasso's, and things like that in a very pedagogic way to show to these urban elites that want to consume this idea of what was modernity, that they should value folk arts and indigenous arts. And with the Carajá was something interesting because when those objects start circulating in habitats, there was an operation in their territory, which was called Operation Bananal. This was about in the 50s. And this operation was designed by the Brazilian state to create a kind of luxurious modernist leisure complex in an island called Bananal Island, which is the territory of the Carajá in the interior of Brazil, that was somehow very close to the capital, Brasilia. So the political elites, would have a kind of leisure complex very close, so they could enjoy the sort of wilderness of the landscape. And here we see the different buildings of this complex. Here is the Great Hotel, right? And I don't know if you see can you see my arrow?
Yes.
Yeah. And on the back, what we see is an indigenous village that they also aimed at design. And Niemeyer, the Brazilian architect, the very famous Brazilian modernist architect, was responsible to design this leisure tourist complex in the island. And what we see, so we see here a kind of process of modern colonization that allowed that those objects would circulate in habitat, although in habitats, the context of colonization was not present. They were only signifiers of modernity. So what we do in this project is the project comes as a true sort of facsimile of the magazine. And we use various procedures that were used by Lina Bobard herself, which is like college, a kind of constructivist graphic language to make associations between the primitive, the indigenous, and the modern. We use the same sort of constructivist modernist project to complicate the narrative and expose the colonial process that was outside the frame when those objects were portraying the magazines as signifiers of modernity. So here you see an example of the cover. This is a cover probably by Lina Bobard, most certainly by Lina Bobard. This is a Lina Bobard drawing, of course, representing a forest. Here we see a modernist window with brise soleil. Outside, you see, the tropical nature, and here the objects, the sculptures of the Carajá. And we use this language to, show
that in fact there was a colonial process, and it was this colonial process that allowed those objects to be extracted from the territories, but also extracted from the historical context and appear in this magazine as signifiers of modernity. So it's a series of procedures of, erasing and complementing archives. Here it's a different image. We erase and just leave some of the narratives to show how, this process was totally connected. This modernist imaginary was totally dependent on and legitimized a colonial enterprise. And here the history of the Niemeyer Hotel. And it's interesting because, the Niemeyer Hotel, placed in this wild in the middle of the Carajá territory, was somehow a sort of architectural manifestation of this relationship between the tropical modernism and the primitive, so that the guests, once they were in the hotel in a kind of panopticon dispositive, they could stay observing, indigenous peoples in their livelihoods. So somehow, consubstantiating, I don't know if that's the word, but, expressing this idea of a certain modernity that embodied a colonial process, embodied a colonial project, manifested in the whole architectural setting designed by modernist Oscar Niemeyer. Here are some images of the hotel. Today, this hotel is a ruin. I didn't have an image to show you. I didn't include, I have an image. It's quite interesting because, the Carajá people have retaken the land and used the sort of base infrastructure of the hotel to build their own houses. And here, another image of Habitat, the cover, how you were, intervening in the cover and using the same language in the sense of how we can appropriate and subvert the means and language and tools of architecture to use them as a means of advocacy. In here, of course, advocacy being thought as something that also operates on the level of image and imaginaries, right? And it was interesting to release this project. This project was releasing in Europe in 2019, and I released it now in 2021 in Brazil. And it's just coincided with the fact that Lina Bobardi was awarded the Venice Biennial Prize, and that there was 2 biographies written about Lina Bobardi. And this project generated in Brazil a very interesting repercussion because contrary to the art field, where questions of colonization, where questions of racial capitalism, or questions of, complicating the kind of hegemonic narratives of modernity, and that we see this sort of spreading the art field in architecture. Architecture is a much more conservative discipline. It's a much more conservative field of knowledge. And I guess we are all in this process now of trying to undo certain hegemonic narratives of our discipline, understanding our discipline complicities with many forms of violence that came together with modernity. Now I'm going to show a project. It's not really a project. It's, it's some thoughts which are really open still, which I call Settler-Modernism, right? Again, trying to expose how, modernism was conceived in a certain way as a form of colonialism. This idea of, defining a modern art in Brazil, or modernity in Brazil in itself, was associated with a process that I call autocolonization or auto-imperialism. For the many intellectuals and artists and painters and poets and writers of the early modernist generation, the spirit of Brazilianhood, the spirit of what they call Brasilidade, Brazilianness, was in the interior of the country. Right? So we should turn the back from the ocean where our connection to Europe was and really look at the interior, because the interior was where the Brazilian soul was. And this idea was also related to a state project that was formulated in the 30s, that modernization itself, the modernization of Brazilian nation, was associated with a process of taking over the hinterlands, of conquering the hinterlands, of colonizing the hinterlands. So you see, for example, sociologist Gilberto Freire, known worldwide, writing that the colonization of Brazil soon ceased to be strictly European to become a process of autocolonization, a process that would, after independence, take on a national character. We see also another very important intellectual in Brazil, Nelson Verdeck Sodré, writing in 1941, that Brazil, the imperative of Brazil is that it was a country that needs to conquer itself. Therefore, it was important to implement what he calls a politics of intra-border imperialism. And finally, let's take the phrase of President Getúlio Vargas, former dictator of Brazil, who ran the country for 15 years from the 30s until 45. And in his conception, he would say that this conquest of the territory is what he called our imperialism, right? In the sense that this autocolonization was what defined Brazil as a modern nation. And this turned into a program which is called March to the West, right? So here is a poster of the Vargas government saying that the true meaning of Brazilianness is the conquest of the West. Very much associated with ideas of manifest destiny that also shaped the colonial ideology of North America, but of course translated to the proper character of Brazilian in the 30s. Another poster with a phrase by Getúlio Vargas saying that Amazonia will cease to be a simple chapter in the history of the earth, meaning a natural space, to become a chapter in the history of civilization. And perhaps the most expressive architectural manifestation of this neo-colonial ideology is the capital Brasília, designed by architect Lúcio Costa. Brasília it has a kind of urban layout, is an urban layout of a cross. Some people interpret it as an airplane, but in fact it is a Catholic cross, as Lúcio Costa said. The deliberate Brasília was born through a deliberate act of possession, a gesture still in the sense of the pioneers along the lines of the colonial tradition, two axes crossing at the right angles, that is the sign of the cross itself. And the very fact that people interpret Brazil as a kind of airplane flying towards progress is also another dimension where we can see that this organic structural relationship between this reenactment of a colonial gesture as the gesture of modernity itself. Here, Brasília, it's a Catholic cross. Again, the march of Brasília's construction. And what is interesting here in terms of the association between coloniality and modernity is that to commemorate the beginning of the construction of Brasília, at the time, President Juscelino Kubitschek ordered to do a mass, a Catholic mass, and the altar was designed by Neymar, this sort of primitivist, tent-like structure to receive the population all over Brazil. And Juscelino Kubitschek in the 50s, he also ordered the Brazilian Air Force to bring a cohort of Carajá people that live in the Bananal Island, that was under the Operation Bananal, to take part in the Catholic Mass. And in doing this, of course, he was trying to reenact the famous scene of Brazilian colonization, which was called the First Mass. So the Portuguese, when they went to colonize other territories, one of the first things they did, and this is registered in the documents, is to celebrate a Catholic Mass. And this is a painting by Victor Meirelles in 19th century, of course, a recreation that wants to make this image of the colonial context a kind of expression of nationality. And I always find how interesting it is to think that, Brasília would somehow embody a kind of new wave of colonialism and would legitimize itself as modernity in that way. And perhaps architecture was one of the most important instruments or ideological mediums that allowed to elaborate the synthesis between the modernity and colonization that would legitimize this violent process of colonization towards indigenous peoples. So let's take the phrase of Lúcio Costa, the urbanist and architect, author of Brasília, and perhaps one of the most important, for sure, one of the most important ideologues of the modernism in Brazil. He used to say, in order to have an architecture that is logically ours, it's necessary to discover the thread of the skein, that is, to resort to the past, to colonial Brazil. That is to say, an architecture that was Brazilian was somehow, was in another way, the architecture of colonialism was somehow the sort of origin of what he's calling Brazilian architecture, and indeed Brazilian modern architecture. This idea that Brazilian modern architecture, the style, the Brazilian style, what was called the Brazilian style after the Second World War, and that launched, a generation of Brazilian modern architects to worldwide acclaim, this relationship was somehow consolidated in an exhibition organized at MoMA in 1943 that was called Brazil Builds, Architecture New and Old. So of course that this connects the synthesis colonial modern that was elaborated by Lúcio Costa is somehow already in the cover, right? When we see a Baroque church in connection to a modernist stair. And indeed, if you go to see the image of the exhibition, you see that the curators invested a lot in showing colonial architecture in relation to modern architecture. So making this ideological construct as a way of curating, right? A curatorial eye that somehow consolidated this idea that modernization was, in one way or another, a kind of unfolding of colonialism. And in the catalog, they also use, these are some images of the catalog, and it's kind of incredible how they invest in this narrative. And it's also remarkable how, colonial architecture or certain colonial architectural complexes like this one, which is the big house we call the Casa Grande, of sugar or a coffee plantation, right? That's the image we are seeing now. It's the big house. How those architectures, which were completely entangled with the violence of colonialism, can be completely, let's say, abstracted from the historical context and come as simple aesthetic reference of modernism, of modernist language, right? So if when look at this image, of course, what we can see in this context is the violence by which, which was operated through this architecture. But, in the catalog, this is only somehow, again, abstracted from this historical context, like habitat, and just presented as a formal aesthetic reference in comparison to modernism. Here's some images of the catalog. And this ideology, it was so powerful that somehow it also manifested in the cities, in constructions, right? Where, even from the important view of heritage, modernism could fit in these historical cities because it was somehow a continuation of colonialism. And that's what I call, in a certain way, settler-modernism. And to conclude this, I just want to show another project by Lúcio Costa, who throughout his career would really, try to synthesize this idea between colonial and modern through various projects. And this is a project of an altar for the International Eucharistic Congress in Rio de Janeiro. And these are the original sketches by Lúcio Costa. And what we see is that his project for this, huge festival organized by the Vatican, we see the flag of the Vatican. His idea was somehow to design a caravel, a colonial boat, approaching the shores of Rio de Janeiro as if it was, somehow another wave of colonization, a boat coming to colonize, to Christianize the population of Brazil. And this was indeed a sign of modernity. This was, in a certain way, the very idea of modernity itself, completely and structurally related to a kind of colonial imaginary. Okay. Now I'm going to a project called Memory of the Earth. This is a project that deals more directly with advocacy and certain types of forensic architecture techniques. So what happened with this idea of colonization when the United States supported a coup d'etat in Brazil in '64 and the military took power, they completely scaled up this idea that was necessary to colonize Brazilian territory and began a process, what they call the occupation and integration of Amazonia in the center of Brazil. This is a map, right, of this idea that, laying out an infrastructure that would open up routes to colonize this area. And this became also a kind of means of state propaganda, saying that the development of Brazil, the modernization of Brazil was really, a plan designed by planners, by modern planners, attempting to modernize, to conquer, to modernize this wild territory. And this is what I call a kind of coupling between a colonial concept called Terra Nullius and a modernist concept called Terra Rasa, tabula rasa, right? This space was seen as a void, and therefore it could be colonized, it could be occupied. And here again, we see this idea that, the interior Amazonia should be modernized, but also that, the embodiment of modernity in Brazil, again, with making reference to this colonial past as if it was, the center and the soul of nationality. Here's some images of my archive on these modernist plannings. It was very much connected to a modernist language already consolidated in the 60s and the 70s. And this is the idea that they would plan the Amazon, that, architecture would be the means by which this territory would be conquered and civilized. And, many commodities and Brazilian economic progress was somehow dependent on this colonization. And here's a city open in the middle of the forest. And of course, that this project led to widespread ecological destruction. Some would call it ecocide. I call it ecocide by design. And we see here how, deforestation in Amazonia is not something produced by the lack of government or by the lack of planning, but in fact, it was the outcome of design. It was the outcome of planning. And here you see the massive before and after environmental destruction that happened because of these plans of the military. So we know that the military in Brazil not only are responsible to this ecocide by design, but also to crimes against humanities through the regime of terror that they installed against activists that opposed the totalitarianism of the government. And in this context, we are called by the public minister in Brazil to help them produce a forensic report on the displacement of the Chavante people that live in central Brazil between, on the edge of Amazonia. They were displaced by the Brazilian Air Force in '66 after a violent campaign of, forced displacements. And then there was an operation with the Brazilian Air Force that brought all this community to another land 500 kilometers away. And after Brazil conducted its truth commission in 2014, we are called to help show that the Chavante group lived in that area from which they have been expelled, right? So in order to do that, we look at the modernizing, at the sort of modernist image of the pacification campaigns that were used in media to communicate that idea that, the conqueror of these indigenous territories was modernization itself. So here is a reportage in a very famous illustrated magazine called O Cruzeiro, and the pictures are by one of the most famous modernist photographers in Brazil, Jean Mazon, and he's somehow translating this colonial process into modern image, right? Brazil, this image is very emblematic, right? The plane flying over, conquering the territory. This was the modernization in Brazil. And of course, that's the language used by Jean Mazon also embodied this relationship, colonial and modern. So what we did was a media archaeology. I call it media archaeology because what we need to do is really to try to locate those settlements that have been photographed, but that they were eventually destroyed, forcibly removed, and did not exist anymore. So we did a kind of, reconstruction, archaeological reconstruction through this archive images of modernity. And I don't know if I can play a video here. Maybe you'd see that. So the idea was that, images can be archaeological artifacts and somehow trying to displace the kind of meaning of this image as image of modernization and civilization, but understanding that there as evidence of violence, and therefore using them to rebuild those villages, which are in fact heritage of those people, but that until now have not been reconstructed. I have to say that this image here was produced in collaboration with Polis. It's an architecture studio by Miguel Darcy and Gabriel Kolowski. We collaborate in different projects, and they are responsible to this interesting reconstruction of the village, which we are using in another project that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So here are these reconstructions. Again, trying to do an archaeology through the media. And we also examined a series of satellite images that were, classified, produced by the United States Air Force. And what is remarkable in analyzing those images forensically is that we found several traces on the ground, several traces on the earth, whose footprint is very much similar to the urban layout of the village that we modeled through this media archaeology. And I'm going to run some of these images. We see the same sort of pattern, an open arc, related to a water stream, and this pattern reproduces and reproducing itself all through this territory, right? In a way that are completely compatible with the archaeological archive that we built from the archive images. So this project, therefore, we could prove that those people lived in these areas. It was transformed in a book, it entered in a court of law. The case is still ongoing, very complicated because of the political situation in Brazil now. But we also did, and was also very important for us in thinking about architecture as advocacy, we made sure to print this very extensive report so that we could distribute those books within the village that exists today of the Xavante people. And this we did very recently in June. And it was interesting to see that, how those objects can make a difference within the schools of the youth. And it was very well received. And I think that dimension of, returning back was very important for us. A project that emerged from this, it's the third project that I want to share with you. It's called Trees, Vines, Palms, and Other Architectural Monuments. So what was striking in this analysis that we see is that if you're going to look the satellite image in a contemporary satellite image, what we are going to see is that there was a patch of trees, a kind of botanic arrangement that grew on the top of the old urban layout, precisely on the top of the urban layout. And we went to see with the elderly, who are the ancient warriors of the Xavante people, to document those sites in loco, right? And we did what I call Incompare, in conjunction to the media archaeology, a landscape archaeology. And here are some images of our expeditions with the elder Policarpo, who was one of the survivors of the genocidal acts committed by the government, and Domingos, who was the geographer that really helped us also documenting those sites. We also looked into other images, and it's kind of remarkable that we found always the same pattern that vegetation had grown on the top of the ancient village, and this is a pattern that indeed repeats itself in different images. Here is the ancient settlement of Bou. This was the sort of geopolitical, cultural capital of the Xavante territory of Maraú Sede. And we did some drone flights to capture, this sort of botanic vegetation that had grown to the village. This is the village of Abdonoyu. Here we see the same pattern. And here is the village of Sino. We see also this arrangement of trees demarcating the archaeological site. In certain way that they can be seen as the ruins, as the vestiges, as the remains of those sites. I want to play a short video for you. Let me see if I can do it. Can you see the video? How is that? You see only the video?
Yeah.
Okay, let's try.
Wajibti orang ihai mana yang sedih. Wajibti ada semasa ada zara.
Sorry, someone sent a message that the video is not playing. Sorry, this was a bit confusing. Can you see the video or?
Not. I can try to share it from my end. You mind?
You could not see the video? Sorry, I didn't understand.
I
Okay.
can't see the video. I can,
Oh, sorry.
You can try again, or I can try and share it from our end.
Okay, if you could please share, that would be great.
Sure. Okay. 1 second.
Sorry for this.
No worries.
Cool.
Dazaru tua wa tezai uto wai hata pibui menewa warazu satenoni hawim pibui menewa tazaha damawa ruti wanyipti ada tedas masa ada zara wanyipti roi hai mana wasede wanyipti ada tedas masa ada zara se utuni mononda dati morobru mononda sozada waruda romhai mana zeh tahawa sozada romhai mana ora waza manhã ni zarani isavizahi bau kami indai no temtia bau ta sora iwa para hatta wa sora tori ari na wa sora hatta ta suste e ota ma oto Lion de ore hama. Torbettile. Lion de ore. Waziriza. Waziriza.
Paulo?
Yeah, can you see me?
Yeah, that's the end of the video, yeah?
Yeah, that's the end of the video. Yeah. So let me share my screen again. Okay, let's try this, share screen. Can you see my PowerPoint now?
Yes.
Okay, so it was very interesting for us. We went with the elder Policarpo there, and when we were filming, you know, I don't call this a film, I call it a document because it has some sort of historical and evidentiary value. It's a kind of video document rather than a video documentary, I would say. And it was very interesting for us because we didn't translate anything on the field. We are just sort of, it was me and a fellow colleague, and we didn't translate anything, just let it flow. And it's kind of remarkable how, you know, Policarpo, who is, you know, he's a geographers, so to speak, could recognize immediately that we were within the village of Boú, which is this village here, So what we are trying to do, what we are doing now, and that's why the project called Trees, Vines, Palms, and Other Architectural Monuments is how can we claim those trees that have grew over those sites as architectural constructions, right? Somehow they are the ruins of those sites. They are the vestige that remains, though they're ruins that are not dead, right? They're ruins that are living. They're living ruins somehow. And we are designing with them. It's kind of, I also like this image very much because you somehow see, you know, the sort of arc-shaped like pattern of distribution of the vegetation. And somehow there's kind of architectural dimension to it that's clearly noticeable when you are on the field. And what we are doing now, the question is that all those areas, as you saw in the video, are in private lands, right? Because of the demarcation of the area was not completed. So basically they are outside the land of the Xavante people. What you saw is really me and my colleagues from the Maraut area enter illegally a private property, well, where those villages are. And of course, this is a very conflictive situation. There's lots of conflicts around those sites because there are cemeteries of those sites. You know, they are where they bury their elderly ones. They are sacred sites, but they all are located in private property that are not, you know, under the sovereignty of the Xavante people. So what we are doing is a petition for the Brazilian Institute for Historic and Artistic Heritage, which deals with, you know, all types of heritage in Brazil, so they can acknowledge and protect officially that those trees, those sites are heritage, architectural heritage of the Xavante people and therefore of Brazil, and that they should be protected as such, right? So this is a kind of strategy which is somehow a strategy of advocacy, a strategy of activism, because those areas are not within Xavante territory. So in order to protect them, maybe we could use the very structures of heritage, right, which were somehow developed as also as a colonial tool, right, to protect those areas, even though they are not within Xavante territory. And there's another dimension of this project, which is an intervention into the archive of architecture itself. Right, so this is a report, one of the reports of heritage. You see this kind of language of ruinology, right, and language of mapping to, so that those areas of, you know, colonial architecture could be considered heritage. And what we are doing is somehow also doing an intervention into the archive of architecture and saying, you know, those sites are also relevant as architecture. Right, those sites are significant as heritage, as architecture. And what this imply within the architecture of the archive of the architectural history, to consider that trees are not part of nature. In fact, they are the outcome of spatial practices. They are outcome of architectural technologies. They are the outcome of landscape design, a landscape design that maybe we don't understand, but which is at the forefront of the fight against climate change, in as much as it doesn't reduce biodiversity, but produces the forest itself, right? It's a form of production of the forest somehow. So we are drawing this petition, and when we are in a kind of crucial moment now to submit it. And I just came back from the land, and we went to collect the signing of, you know, the elderly and all the chiefs of the territory. There's about, you know, 11 sort of settlements there now, and all the chiefs of the territory signed this petition so that we can submit it to government. And here are some images of we doing this process. This was in June now, and now we are working with these documents. And I just want to show these two images. This first image of the village Boú is an image of 2017, I would say. So we see that the whole area is still, you know, forested. It's in a very dense way. And I went there now, and what we see is this. This is a drone image of the contemporary site of Boú. And this reflects a lot the sort of mentality and politics and ideology of the fascist, neo-fascist government of Bolsonaro, who not only completely despise indigenous people in very racial terms, but also has no concern for the environment itself. So although he's not directly involved in the deforestation of this area, the whole sort of environment and the whole sort of ideology that he propagates empower people to go out and destroy the forest, right? And just, the center of Baú has remained because Chief Damião Pardzinaé went to the farmer and said, either you leave it or we are going to hunt your cattle. So pressuring them. I don't have much time. I want to do just, about an hour and leave some space. I understand this go until 8 o'clock and we are approaching sort of an hour. I have 3 projects to show, but I will conclude with this one. And the way in which the Chicago Architecture Biennial somehow enters into this understanding of, what is modernity, what is, what we are dealing now in architecture, and how, architecture as a media, as a tool can be subverted and reconfigured, to tell other stories, right? To tell not only the stories of those who won, but also of those who struggle. And we can talk about this maybe in the questions. So I want to close with this project. It's called Demarcation. This is a very simple, small project, but it's very dear to my heart, and maybe it's an interesting endnote. So what happened in this territory where I work with the Chavante people is that unlike everywhere, every other land in Brazil, where the state is required to place signs around the land to demarcate it as indigenous land, in this particular territory, this hasn't happened. And when it happened, all the, the big farmers, let's say the settlers, took those boards, those signs out. And we were called by an NGO with the proposal of doing a workshop on environmental and territorial monitoring for the youth and also for the, the adult members of this land called Maraiot Sede. And, of course, it was kind of introductory workshop, and we want to, give some sort of sense of, of the kind of instruments through which we today map and produce cartographies like GPS, like different sort of applications, different sorts of apps, and sort of like some basic understandings of cartography and things like that, because it was a program that should empower or, support or help to form those people to conduct their own monitoring in this territory, in as much as it's always under threat of being invaded by farmers and settlers and things like that. And what we realized is that somehow inspired in Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed is that we could not come with this whole Western episteme that is maps and cartography, in fact, a colonial modern episteme, and, starting to talk about things that are completely abstract, like, different degrees where you are, sort of geolocation and positions, and, how we can understand this sort of complete abstraction, in fact, of the earth, right? And start teaching that. So we adopt a kind of another approach, and I would call it a Freirean, Paulo Freirean approach, is to see how can we depart from the reality? What is the problem, the territorial problem? What is, something that is completely attached to the dynamics of those communities that could allow us to use as a kind of pedagogic device? And then this conversation on the lack of sign emerged, right? So we decided to do what we call auto-demarcation, self-demarcation. And, with the youth, we conduct a series of design workshops, discussing what would be those signs, how they should be drawn, where they should be placed, what size they should be, conceived, and where we would articulate them. And this is what we did. It was very interesting how the youth sort of engaged in this process, and we produced several of these, large billboards in a kind of design workshop. And these are some images of the boards of the signs that we did. And when I came back, there was some shootings in the signs, in the boards, which is another demonstration of the very tense situation that this community sometimes has to confront, even though their lands have been demarcated, but not properly. I think I went here. I guess, something that I was trying to convey here is a kind of expanded view of what one can understand as architecture and how, contemporary architecture, very much in the lines of Lina Bobardi, who was also a kind of multi-player in her fields, involves questions of writing, curating, publishing, design, building, preservation, conservation, all these different means and instruments by which space is produced. And how can we conceive architecture as a discipline that can acknowledge first its complicity with the colonial modern violence by which our cities throughout the Americas and in the United States very much so have been complicit in legitimize the process of violence. And once we understand this, how can we undermine the very means by which architecture does this process and utilize the tools of architecture to conduct certain forms of advocacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think now we'll open to questions, and feel free to the people joining on to type in the chat or to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes.
Thank you so much. That was really incredible, and I think that some like a sort of archaeological view of architecture or the view of history of what we're dealing with is often missing from the pedagogy in many schools, and I think that showing us different methods that you're looking at history is really incredible to see. I have a question.
I'm not sure I got the first. Sorry, the audio is not super great. I mean, maybe you are speaking too far. Sorry for that.
Okay, how about now? Better?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, I was just saying thank you, and the methods of archaeologically investigating architecture and the histories that architecture existed in, and the present that it created is really incredible, and something that I think is missing from many pedagogies of architecture and design. So that was very inspiring, and thank you for that. I have a question more generally about the idea of like Derrida's traces or something that stays with a form regardless of its abstraction from the context. Like when you were showing Casa Grande, I think you called it, or the plantation house. In plan, there's like a garden that's surrounded by a cloister, and I meant cloister is a sort of a typology that comes up in all across the world in all different places. Yeah, it's kind of like a constant struggle of what stays, like what comes along with the form if it's not inherent to that sort of context of the house. So once it is abstracted from the context, like what's your views on what stays with it and how we approach those kind of questions?
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me to abstract is, if I look to all those projects, I would see them in a way as a resistance to abstraction, as a kind of, commitment, almost obsessive to contextualize, to historicize, to understand where it came from, to understand what is outside of the frame, right? To understand what is registered but cannot be read or is not read, right? What is the void? What is untold? So in that sense, I think that those projects show something completely opposed to a kind of very common exercise in architecture, which is to proceed through process of abstraction. So you'd have some form of formal arrangement that you could use to produce form, right? So there is a way in which those projects resist abstraction, you know, and resist abstraction in as much as it acknowledges that processes of abstracting, like in Lina Bobardi in the magazine, where, you know, don't have the context, you have just that object as a modern piece of art. When you have a plantation architecture that appears, because it's white, because it's simple, because it is minimalist, it appears as something that, you know, we should go back to and study, because it can be something that represents identity, that represents nationality, and that, you know, represents modernization, right? So when I look to this plantation house, of course, what comes to my mind is how it operated on space and what is its role in, you know, settling the land, expelling people, in, you know, operating a necro regime, right? A regime that was based on a political, on a necropolitics, right? So that would be my first response, a bit of resistance to this kind of abstraction. It can be that, you know, later in my work, I would maybe allow it to emerge more. But when you say, you know, what stays in form, and here, you know, I remember a lot the words of A.L. Weissman, and how, you know, we discussed a lot, you know, what is a kind of forensic dimension of architecture, which is, you know, the form and shape of architecture, but also its materiality. It's a kind of sensor. It registers history, right? That's what is archaeology. In fact, it registers history in its own materiality, and in the case of my projects, in the nature itself. So I guess I'm interested in how, you know, form is shaped by political forces, and what kind of political forces one can recognize in architectural form. Yeah, that's it. And I think there's a risk in abstraction, so to speak, to become complicit.
I think it just becomes a little more muddy when we're talking about certain forms that appear across different contexts. It's not like, it's just a thought. Like, certain forms appear in different contexts, in different times, in different materials, but still drawn with the same. I understand what you're saying about the resistance of abstraction, but it's just something that is on my mind. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, maybe it's a question, you know, which forms stay, right? Which forms stay? And here there is a sense that, you know, that village which we are modeling, and there is something that attracts me a lot in trying to model as it is, because it is a question of heritage, right? You know, that's a kind of forefront of heritage technology somehow, how to work with digital tools to, you know, understand objects of art and architecture. But the question is that that form was not considered architecture. No, it was not considered. It was considered like, you know, primitive huts or something very primitive, very basic, precisely because we could not recognize how it was shaping the space, because the space it was shaping is not only the village, it's the whole environment, right? It's the whole sort of landscape. And I guess, you know, to that route, maybe I would be more interested in thinking about, you know, what forms stay and what forms, what formations or typologies somehow have disappeared.
Paulo, this might not be totally finished as a question, but I just wanted to kind of bring this up. You know, I'm from Colombia, and some the objects, the pre-Columbian objects, some of them, like for example, the gold pieces that have been, you know, stolen and taken to museums all over the world. Indigenous elders have thought of these objects as relatives who were buried for a reason, and were buried in very specific sites for a reason. And that kind of lets us see just a tiny bit of the relationality that these objects had to a living tradition, and a tradition that's still alive, but that it's hard to reproduce because of colonization and all the processes that you're documenting. I'm wondering, from what you've done so far, and in your work with these objects, if you can, if you've delved into relationality of these objects now and how to engage these objects, or not just the objects, but the people and the traditions in a way that isn't creating maybe a larger frame, but yet another frame. You know, what is the way to get out of the frame and get into a relation is what I'm asking.
Wow. Thank you for the question. It's a big one. Yeah, it's a big one. I guess, you know, the way in which those objects are displayed in museums, the way they have been extracted, pillaged, you know, and stored in museums as signifiers of culture, is very much a process of abstraction, right? The museum is that space in which the minute it's there, it's a kind of epistemic device where you can, you know, redefine the role of objects. And this process is very violent because, as you said, it eliminates or it doesn't acknowledge the relationality of the object. Some of those objects should never be exposed, right? This Ailton Krenak, an intellectual here from Brazil, from the Krenak people, he did several consultancies in the Modern Museum of Art in São Paulo that host those objects. The Modern Museum of Art in São Paulo was founded by Lina Bobardi and her partner, Pietro Maria Bardi. And because of, you know, the sort of moment that we live now where institutions are in need to redefine their framings, right? And acknowledge their complicity in sustaining colonial racist narratives, the directors of the museum start to a process of consultancy with, you know, different intellectuals and artists and curators of indigenous background. And it was interesting to talk to Krenak about this because he says, you know, these objects should not even be exposed. You know, it was not made for this. It has a completely different sort of role in the world, right? And that's why I mean, you know, how this object of abstraction, its process of abstraction is also a way of, you know, violating those objects and the rights which are attached to those objects. I guess, you know, the question of, you know, how can we approach this and not create another framing and instead of, you know, searching for a relationality, as you mentioned, it's something that I cannot do. I think, you know, I think this is very much for, you know, and this has been done, and I can quote an example for the communities that are, you know, engaging with these institutions and you know, and sort of, you know, posing some questions. There was a very interesting moment now in the São Paulo Biennial, which was the first biennial that brought, you know, a good cohort of indigenous groups. And, you know, they have been called it the Indigenous Biennial in São Paulo. So I guess it's for, you know, these peoples. I as an architect, you know, what I can do, what I think, you know, the way I frame my work is really, first of all, acknowledging the way in which architecture is a means of power, is an instrument of power, and precisely in relation to, you know, its colonial role in modernity, for example. And through the knowledge that I have been privileged to get about this, I can align myself with those groups in terms of providing certain types of expertise and knowledge that can, you know, establish an alliance with them, right? Establish an alliance with them and somehow denouncing, exposing, you know, the means by which state documents, state tools, state maps, state projects, you know, how they embody a certain violence, although the very ideology of architecture would want us to see this as progress and civilization, right? That's the kind of ideological role of architecture. At the same time, it instrumentalized the violence. So I guess that's more where I situate myself. And just to conclude, there was a very interesting, it has been something very interesting in Brazil. The Tupinambá, they would have, I don't know how to call manto. It's like a kind of ceremonial dress made all of feathers, usually red feathers. And there exists none in Brazil anymore. They're just in European museums and they can be exposed because they are too fragile, right? So the Tupinambá people, the young people, managed to go to visit these museums, see those pieces, and remember and recall and reconstruct the way by which they were produced. And now they are producing again something that, you know, for many generations, they didn't have the knowledge of.
And of course, it's going to be, much harder to make those museums to return those objects. And this is a kind of much broader discussion. But just the fact that, this process of, getting contact with these objects and how there's a kind of ancestral memory to this and how this can operate here, not only in the present, but towards the future, for me is fascinating and very powerful. And the way that I can mobilize my tools, my knowledge, my infrastructure, my networks to ally to this process, which is really at the forefront of fighting the fascist government here in Brazil, here at the avant-garde of politics, I think that's the way I can, contribute.
Thank you. Also want to invite people online, if you want to type in your questions, you can read them out. Or if you want to speak, you can also speak.
Hi, Paulo, it's Anjali here.
Hey, Anjali. Thank you for coming. Good to hear you.
Yeah, I'm not going to put my camera on because I'm in bed. So, but I wanted to say thank you for your lecture or series of projects that you so generously have been outlining. But I'm very interested in settler modernism in a very different sense, in that I'm interested in the way that settler modernism has become settler populism culturally. Now kind of being read through everything that has been, let's say, explored as spiritual or as possible is now being rearticulated in terms of, like, I don't know, the way that, I mean, to be very crude about it, the way that kind of shops are emerging inside, like, inside the fabric of the city, that with bearded men and big barrels and kind of frontier aesthetics are kind of basically, emerging as a kind of formation of, I would say, the continuation of a kind of fascination with settler aesthetics. That is a big project that I'm sort of have been absorbing and witnessing over the last 15 years, watching it sort of emerge in LA and coming to Berlin and coming to London. But I would say that that kind of frontier aesthetic is now in fashion and in everything, and is kind of normalized and is a form of whiteness that is going kind of unnoticed and is like around us all the time. It is a kind of spiritual and necropolitical style, I would say, a kind of necropolitical spiritual style, which is kind of being kind of normalized as mindfulness or as organic culture or whatever. But I just want to go back to this thing of abstraction, because I see abstraction in relation to Blackness, in relation to the fight to maintain being in amongst a aesthetic violence, which one could call colonization, neocolonization, a creation of categories of race, the creation of categories of that unbind us from the planetary and turn us into the object, into racialized objects. The way that Western culture permits itself to its pathological attachment to its racist categorical impositions, and how to deal with that total violence is, for me, a form of abstraction. Somebody earlier was talking about relationality outside of the frame. I would say the frame is violent. The relationality is abstract, meaning that how do we create a counter abstraction that cannot be captured? This has to come from experience. I would say it has to be an ontological aesthetic as opposed to aesthetics of total violence. We have to find a language that I mean, these words are used a lot now in relation to Blackness, but refusal, is not just something that happens. It's something that has to be protected. And I would say in some way weaponized, in some way needs new languages, needs neologisms, needs new code, if you like. So Denise Ferreira de Silva has written a lot about, I would say, methodologies of abstraction, something that we've been doing as Otolith Group with Denise is thinking around kind of forms of abstraction in relation to total violence and aesthetic total violence. And as she says, the perennial failure of Homo aestheticus, which, and I'll just quote, which requires the perpetual renewal of the aesthetic as an operation which, irrespective of its beauties of horrors, cannot help but be the renewal of catastrophe. So I would point everybody, and I'll put it in the chat, this fantastic essay by Rizvana Bradley and by Denise Ferreira de Silva in efflux yet again, but there it is. Huff puff, but it's called 4 Theses on Aesthetics. So I want to find a language that, as an artist at least, that begins to take the archives that we live with and put them in a renewed relation to abstraction that produces third spaces, fourth spaces of where one can think inside rather than being everything being outlined, right? The relationality produces new spaces, and where things can become, I don't know, live outside of the enclosures. So I will put this wonderful essay in the chat, but this is just my little contribution at 1 a.m. from my bedroom.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. There's a lot there. I know it's not a question, it's more like a, reflection and I guess, the sort of abstraction is not something that I have thought about. It was a question that, just emerged here. And somehow if I see what I'm showing now, I guess the move is very much sort of, maybe against a type of abstraction, structurally modernist, that, operates itself somehow as a form of violence in as much as it serves to break and to also to not acknowledge that, the sort of that space, maybe the third space, that fourth space where those objects were alive, right? It's a form of killing somehow. But I'm looking forward to see more about the question of abstraction, and this was very insightful and very provocative, and I guess it'd be great to think more about that also with Denise in her essay. And about the first part, the sort of aesthetics of the frontier, I totally agree with you. I mean, it could not be, more right to the point. And I think it's kind of, fascinating, this idea of settler populism. This, describes a lot what we're living in Brazil here now, and I think also in America, in the United States, and how there is, this revival of, some frontier mythologies in cinema, in people going to, to the moon or to space outside, and all this sort of ways in which America sort of still performing its identity as sort of empire, always expanding its frontiers.
I guess this would be interesting to see what you guys are doing in terms of, how this is manifesting nowadays, right? How we see this also within the city. For example, when we did the biennial, the Vancouver biennial, the Chicago biennial, we went to this unlearning geographies travels, as we call it, and we went to Vancouver. And I don't know if you folks know Vancouver, but Vancouver is that place, where you have this sort of condos all around, specifically the center of the city, and they are displacing, the people that live there. And we met with some indigenous activists there, and it's clear to them that they see gentrification as just another manifestation of a frontier project, right? And in those condos, also as a kind of expression of a kind of frontier aesthetics. So I guess I've been thinking this about Settler-Modernism, I'm, in the kind of more historical sense, also very focused on Brazilian modernism, because I'm writing about this now, and I'm writing about, how all this idea of colonial modernity is deeply racialized, specifically by, the sort of most important protagonists of this project, and how, this idea of the frontier comes with an idea of white supremacy, even if it's kind of different for the United States, because in Brazil, the idea of the miscegenation and things like that play a lot in the kind of ideology of the nation, but also writing about this. So I have been looking more historically, maybe this idea of Settler-Modernism. So it would be great to, to unfold what are the sort of contemporary manifestations of this. And certainly there is a lot, not only, I think, in America, but here in Brazil, I can definitely recognize. I wonder how London, you're seeing this in London and Berlin.
I mean, certainly in Brazil, I see it everywhere, but one can see it everywhere. I'm not going to go into it now because I don't know enough about Brazil, but yeah, I think it's extremely important to unfold the kind of work that you are doing is definitely incredible in terms of unfolding the kind of creation and structures of how white supremacy has found itself to be so powerful. It is not by chance, but it's what I'm interested in, I suppose, is its remaining power, its hold now. In India, I can speak about India a little bit, just you can see that this going on in India in a kind of Hindutva, Modi-esque kind of aesthetics, one could say. But yeah, I'll leave it there. I just wanted to ask you one more thing. You talked about trees and the difference between, because, I've been working a lot on Tagore, and he was a terraformer in Shantiniketan in India, and he planted many trees, and he wrote about how he will never see them fully grown, but that is the beauty of the tree planter, that they plant to never see them fully grown. But you said something earlier, I just wondered if you could elaborate or just a little bit, you said it very fast, and I would just like it if you could repeat what you said, maybe, about trees. And the forest.
I got in contact with archaeology when I was a student, and I was living in Ecuador. I was doing my PhD, and I was living in Ecuador, and I had the opportunity to attend one of the largest congress of archaeologists of the Amazon. There was like the whole world of Amazon archaeology was there, very prominent figures, and I attended this. And since then, I continue to, to pursue and to talk to them, to those archaeologists and also ethnobotanists. And what's interesting is that, there is a particular figure which is called William Ballet. I have another project about this, which is called a botanic architecture, an architectural botany. And, he learned from many indigenous groups that he had been working with how to identify certain types of trees and know that they have been planted for, hundreds of years ago, right? How the forest is in fact a garden, right? How, the peoples of the forest, how they can recognize something that for us looks like a kind of generic green, and they see, things saturated with symbols and histories and things like that. And for me, it was really interesting to think about how can we conceive this in terms of architecture, right? How can we see those trees as ruins, you know, and what does it imply, not only in terms of an activism, because this allowed me to say, you know, those sites need to be protected because they are archaeological heritage, but also to challenge the very epistemic boundaries of architecture, because, you know, architecture in its origin, it was really something that was conceived against nature. It was always conceived something as, you know, to colonize, to civilize, to domesticate. And in a moment of climate catastrophe, as we are, you know, living now, I also think that those terraforming, gardening, producing, you know, landscape design technologies, which are embodied in those cultures and, you know, in those trees, it's really fascinating how, you know, there's so much to learn on that front.
So we have a question here from the student. Before that, I just wanted to add, just because I think this idea of abstraction and then to go into terraforming are related in terms of the relational as well. I'm using here the lens articulated by Eduardo Kahn in How Forests Think, and that the relations between, say, you know, a branch falling, a monkey falling off the branch, or, you know, alerting other monkeys about what's happening. All of these things are a way of thought, a bigger way of thinking. And for us, maybe from the Western perspective, that might be an abstraction to put that into language, you know, maybe into, you know, abstractions in terms of form and painting or architecture or language in terms of theory. But for someone living in the forest for a long time who has learned certain practices on how to hunt, how to survive, how to live in the forest, to be in relation with the forest, these things are not abstraction. They're actually a way of reproducing life. So this abstraction, figuration or abstraction, language, etc. I guess my question is, just to, before we go on to Augustine, an ongoing question for me is abstraction in relation to what? And that what we're calling here abstraction in terms of our misunderstanding of indigenous life might be just a very complex semiotic system of figuration. Or not figuration, something beyond, of relation, I guess. So yeah.
No, absolutely. I think Kohn would be the great guy to speak about abstraction and the forest. Definitely his work in terms of the semiotics of the forest needs a lot of abstraction so he can understand the language that the forest speaks. I would say, though, no, that my work, I mean, those questions are important, absolutely, but in terms of, you know, different systems of knowledge, but I don't consider my work very much related. I don't think it's the key to what I'm trying to do is ethnographic or anthropological. In fact, there's almost a kind of resistance to that in a certain way. So although it's important, of course, to understand the difference and, you know, to acknowledge the different ways of dealing with things and of being, I think my work's, let's say, less ethnographic and more militant.
So I was kind of wondering about, I didn't hear you mention much about the economy and money, and which also is kind of, I think, one of the most ubiquitous forms of abstraction. And I know that the economy is probably the driving factor for most political decisions, and was certainly a factor in the development of Brasília, the capital, which I heard took 3 years to build the entire city, which I can only imagine took a ton of money, or probably a scary amount of cheap labor. And I also see money as one of those hidden colonial factors that needs kind of its roots exposed. And it seems that the relationship to money between kind of European civilizations and indigenous civilizations is probably insanely different. and I'm sure it's far more abstract to European civilizations or the colonizer. And I also think that the relationship between the economy and architecture is annoyingly unavoidable. So I guess I was kind of wondering how that kind of ties into your work process, and maybe how you see the relationship to like the global economy and colonization and modernity to your work, and just like how you think about that, or how you deal with it.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It was nice what you said, because you think money is abstraction, and cartographies are abstractions. Of course, money is the ultimate abstraction of everything, right? So somehow there is a way in which Western knowledge operates just through abstraction, right? To measuring, transforming things into measures, transforming things into numbers, and a kind of constant process of somehow, detaching things from things themselves, right? Detach things from things themselves in a certain way. And so that way, I think it's interesting to think, how Western knowledge is really based on that, and how other forms of knowledge, other epistemologies operate in a completely different way. It's really by, what is the opposite of abstraction? About creating meaning and attachments and relationships and relationalities, and everything somehow is based on that, right? There is a test by Pierre Clastres where he talks about, he is very famous anthropologist that worked with the Guarani of Paraguay in the 70s and died really young. He was very influential for Deleuze and some of these philosophers' generations in Europe. And he's writing about the state, that the question is, when do the state emerge, right? When do the state emerge? That is to say, when does power that was in society gets abstracted in one figure, which is the king, the god, the priest, or whatever one wants to call, right? So something that was part of the social body, gets abstracted into this figure, this kind of mythical figure of the king, of the state itself. And he shows how, the Guarani, everything that they do is to avoid that the power becomes something abstract. That is, to avoid that power, gets out of the social context. And then he calls that, if the history of the Western civilizations, the history of the class struggle, the history of those non-Western peoples, for example, the Guarani, is the history of the battle against the state. Also, the society moves, to avoid that power becomes abstract. Maybe, through some of these, I could relate to this idea. I think that's something of the perspective. I think Angelica is also moving a kind of different way, and would be great to kind of unfold this with time. There's kind of deep things that, and that was interesting. And then to the global economy. Yes, absolutely. It's that's the way that, let's say, it's like this, if you go to those areas, to these frontier areas, that's where capitalism is operating. That's where capitalism is remaking itself somehow, right? Because that is the place where, capitalism, it's a thief, right? It just take things. It's not, when things are exchanged, that's, the kind of formal level of capitalism. But capitalism, at its essence, it's about, pillaging. It's about taking things through violence. And when you go to these frontier areas, Marx called this primitive accumulation, right? So when you go to these areas, you see, how capitalism, as in a frontier that Angelica was saying, expands itself, right? So I guess I'm interested in how, those, the markets, geopolitical economies, how they operate, on the sort of most sort of, invisible, difficult of access, sort of informal spaces, and how this is not a kind of backward form of capitalism. That's why, Marx would call it primitive because it's the first, right? But that's the forefront of capitalism in a certain way, right? That's how we see what's coming next. And I think that's
yeah, that was the way I would maybe understand this. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Oh,
Thank you.
thank you so much for your really, really brilliant presentation. And I really wanted to talk about this question of the colonial imaginary, and perhaps ask you, are you referencing Lacan and, the imaginary in Lacan, or is it, something else? And then my second question is also perhaps, about the your previous project, Forest Law, which was at the São Paulo Biennial. And could you talk maybe, is there a connection between that project and the current research that you're doing right now? Thank you.
Thank you. Seruberi, am I, yeah, is that
Yeah,
right?
yes, that's right, yes.
Okay, cool, thanks. Thanks for the question. It's not like, some of my work, I see, it's also like somehow lacks theory in a certain way, specifically more recent in a certain way. I think it lacks theory, and maybe that's bad, maybe that's not good, maybe it's a void, but somehow it's also operating on a kind of journalistic, level in a certain way, more descriptive, more historical than conceptual in a certain way. But it's not Lacan. Certainly, I should read something about it because it would help me for sure. And if you can indicate what you have been thinking about, where what resonates with you, I'd love to read. And I guess if I should, locate one theory, it's very much, I would say, maybe Edward Said, in the way that he called imaginative geographies, and how, colonialism has a sort of spatial geographic imagination that defines, relationships between the eye of, Western world and others, right? Also in racial terms, in spatial terms, and things like that. And, this colonial imaginary is really something that continues in Brazil as it continues in America, right? As something that defines an idea of identity and nationalism and things like that. And as Angelica said, it is becoming also kind of populism, right? It's also a kind of force within kind of neo-fascist discourse. This is clear here. We see it like Bolsonaro saying this every day, right? How he takes this idea of, also in very sort of racist terms. So I guess this is a kind of very strong imaginary. But what I'm interested in is how this imaginary was thought to be progressive when the modernist generation crafted, because that was a kind of, avant-garde somehow. At least the way it's consolidated in the public sphere in Brazil now, it's very much a kind of legacy of modernism. And modernism, and it's so identified as national identity, like Brasilia, that's very difficult to do the work of undoing it. I guess institutions are trying to do it, they're starting to do it, but it's very difficult to do it. It's very difficult to do it. For example, I'm writing a text now on Lúcio Costa, and Lúcio Costa, which is like this major figure here, there's many, many passages where you can see that white supremacy was completely important for him to define his idea of modern architecture, even if it's not spelled out. It's like all in between the lines. He's always talking about race and how, the white race is kind of superior, but in a very weird way. But this has never been discussed in architecture schools in a certain way. So I guess, my work now is very much, I don't know, trying to, after this habitat, it's also trying to, it's a kind of fighting against my own discipline, right? I have to undo the kind of way I learned architecture in a certain way. It's a project against architecture. I would call it against architecture. And forest law, thank you for asking. I think, forest law, the question there was like, what is the boundaries that define what is a subject? What is the boundaries that define what is nature and what is not? What's the boundaries that define the subject and object? And of course, the idea that a different legal regime or a regime of rights could be could be developed by assuming different perspectives in relation to the Western ways of always objectifying nature, right? And this different perspective implies that we question this kind of seminal epistemic organization between nature and culture, right? That's what Latour is going to say. That's kind of the base of modernity, right? It's kind of separation. And what does mean if we complicate it, or we abolish this division and we learn from cosmologies and philosophies and politics of different indigenous intellectuals and indigenous groups that have been pushing forward this agenda. And in Ecuador, this is very clear. No, you turn on the television, people are talking about Pachamama. No, they are sort of thinking about if they should leave the oil on the ground and things like that. And I guess the project, especially the trees, vines, and palms and other architectural monuments, I do a kind of similar operation, right, which kind of challenge this sort of epistemic divide between nature and culture, right, which is in forest law, appears in the frame of law and philosophy and political philosophy in many different ways. I try to kind of challenge this through architecture and through the various archives of architecture, right? So if you acknowledge that a tree is an architecture, what does this imply in terms of understanding architecture itself? And it's kind of interesting because I was a fellow at the Canadian Center for Architecture. And usually, they have this kind of, I don't know if you know this institution, but they have this amazing archive with, Gordon Mata Clark and who else is there? And Frank Gehry and Cedric Price, and, it's amazing archive. And usually what you do as an architectural researcher, you go there, you find things in archive, and you can produce different knowledge by mobilizing the archive. So when I was a fellow there, what I decided to do is say, what is the void of this archive? And the void of this archive was precisely the fact that CCA, as other kind of institutions, is a colonial settler institution in indigenous land, but it could never acknowledge within their own archives what is the type of architectures or landscape designs in which they are sitting, right? Because that's what the landscape that have been shaped. So I proposed to them that they should, include in their archives, together with, the masters of architecture, other types of landscape formation, right? That came from a different technology of design, as for example, producing trees, by the way, which have a relationship to the land. So, and by doing that, we kind of challenge the very epistemic apparatus of the archive itself, because those trees, they should belong to a natural history museum. That's probably where people would put them. For example, you have an archive of an ethnobotanist, you go to Smithsonian Museum, to the New York Botanic Museum, because, the very frame of understanding this as still part of nature, right? That was the kind of epistemic that we learn with modern museums, right? So you have places for art and places for nature, and this should go on nature. So what it happens when you say, in fact, this is architecture. In fact, there's planning here. In fact, there's rationality. In fact, there is, a pattern, in fact, this is a technology. How can we learn from this technology that, produce trees? And that sort of spatial technology. And I think that's what fascinates me, also it's a activist, militant project, but it also challenged the very nature of our understanding of what architecture is.
Yeah, no, you really answered the question. Thank you. I don't know if I'm taking up too much space, but if there is, I wanted to also make a brief comment about Marianne von Osten, and to say thank you for mentioning her and her research, and also to say that perhaps two conceptual perspectives that may intersect with yours is, I think, Gayatri Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak, I think, which also deals with an imaginary, a colonial imaginary, though textual, and she's really thinking about the colonial imaginary through texts that were written by in India, but in sort of colonial India. And then the other is Kobina Mercer, a British scholar who has written about architecture in various parts of the world. And he is an art historian officially, but he also writes about, he's also contributed to a book that Marianne von Osten did on the colonial modern. I don't know if you've
Oh, yeah.
heard of
Yeah,
that.
no, that's a big reference for me.
Yes, so he's in that book, and so he talks about how can we, I guess, undo those binaries of thinking just this is the colonial and this is the primitive, which is something I think you're also engaging as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, great reference for sure. Thank you so much. If you can type just the name, that would be awesome.
Okay, I will just put it in there. Thank you. You're welcome. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Paulo. That's all the time we have.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Amazing.